The package was sitting on my doorstep when I came home from a wedding shoot, and I almost stepped over it because I was tired and carrying 2 camera bags and a tripod. Then I saw the handwriting on the label, and I stopped on my own front step and did not move for a long time because the handwriting belonged to my father, and my father had been dead for 6 months. I stood there in the dark with my key still in my hand. The label was unmistakable. That careful, slightly shaking block print he had used my whole life, the print that had been on every birthday envelope I ever received from him. The return address was my parents' house. The postmark was old, and I understood, slowly, the way you understand something you do not want to be true, that my father had mailed this package before he died, and that it had been lost or delayed somewhere in the machinery of the post for half a year, and that it had now found its way home to me, a final piece of mail from a man who was no longer anywhere to receive a reply. My name is Rachel Calloway. I am 45 years old, and I have made my living for over 20 years as a wedding photographer in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am going to tell you what was inside that package, but to understand what it did to me, why I sat on my kitchen floor for most of that night, you have to understand the exact thing I had believed about my father for 45 years, and the exact size of the wound that belief had left. So, let me tell you about being the disappointment. I want to be fair to my father from the very start, because this is not a story about a monster. My father, Walter Calloway, never raised a hand to me, never raised his voice to me, never once told me he did not love me. He was not cruel. What my father was quiet, and not the warm kind of quiet, the kind that makes a room feel safe. He was withholding. He was a man who kept his approval locked in a drawer somewhere, and who I believed, for 45 years, simply did not have any of it set aside for me. Because there were 2 of us. My younger sister Lauren, and me. And from very early on, I understood that Lauren was the one. Lauren was the one who did things the way our parents could be proud of out loud. Lauren went into finance. Lauren married a man with a corner office. Lauren bought the kind of house you photograph for a magazine. And when Lauren did these things, I watched our father's face do something it almost never did. It opened. He would talk about Lauren's promotions at dinner. He would repeat the name of her husband's firm to neighbors. Lauren walked into a room, and my father's quiet lifted, just slightly, like a curtain. And I want to tell you what my father's face did when I walked into a room, but first I have to tell you what I became, because the contrast is the whole engine of this story. I became a photographer. I did not become a thing with a corner office. From the time I was a teenager, what I loved was a camera, light and faces, and the half-second where a person forgets to perform, and you catch who they actually are. I built a real career out of it. I photographed weddings, and I was good, and I was busy, and I supported myself with it for 2 decades. But in my family, photographer was never heard as a career. It was heard as a charming failure to launch. My mother called it my little business. And my father, when the subject of my work came up, would go quiet in a particular way, a flat, polite, disappointed quiet, and change the subject. I cannot count the number of dinners at which my sister's spreadsheet was a triumph, and my photographs of actual human joy were a thing the table moved gently past. So the belief formed, and then it set like concrete. My father loved me. I never doubted that he loved me. But my father did not admire me. He had looked at the life I built, the work I was proud of, and he had quietly filed it under disappointment, and he had never once, in 45 years, said a single sentence to make me think otherwise. I had a sister he was proud of, and I was the other daughter, and I built my entire adult understanding of myself in the cold shadow of that. Let me give you one scene, because one scene tells it better than any summary. When I was 26, I shot my first big wedding entirely on my own. A real one, 200 guests, the kind of job that meant my little business might actually be a business. I was so proud I could barely sleep. I brought a folder of the best prints to Sunday dinner to show my parents. And I remember my father took the folder, and he turned the pages, slowly, and he did not say anything for a long time, and the not saying stretched out until it filled the whole room. And then he closed the folder and said, "These are nice, Rachel. Are you putting any of this money away?" That was it. That was the whole response. I had brought him the proof that I was good at the one thing I loved, and he had heard it as a reason to worry about my retirement account. I drove home that night and I cried, and I told myself the thing I would tell myself for the next 20 years. He will never see it. He will never, ever see it. I was wrong about that. I just would not find out how wrong for 19 more years. And the comparison was always right there, always in the room, because Lauren was always in the room. I do not blame my sister for this. I want to say that clearly because none of it was Lauren's doing. But I grew up watching a kind of arithmetic happen at every family gathering. Lauren would mention a number, a salary, a bonus, a square footage, and my father would nod slowly, and his shoulders would come down from around his ears, and I could see, physically see, relief move through him. And then the conversation would come to me, to my latest wedding, my latest happy couple, and my father's shoulders would go back up. For 45 years, I read that as the difference between a daughter who pleased him and a daughter who let him down. I had the mechanism exactly right, and the meaning exactly backward, and it would take a cardboard box to teach me the difference. 2 years ago, my father was diagnosed with the illness that would, over about 18 months, take him. And I want to be honest about those 18 months, because they are part of what I have had to forgive myself for. I did not pull away from him while he was dying. I went home. I sat with him, but I sat with him as the daughter I had always been in that house. Careful, a little braced, a little on the outside. I kept waiting, I think, even then, even at the end. Some childish, hopeful, 43-year-old part of me kept thinking that a dying man might finally say the thing. That somewhere in those last months, my father would take my hand and tell me he saw me, that he was proud, that the life I had built was not a disappointment to him. I waited for it through every visit, and it did not come. My father was quiet to the end. He told me he loved me, near the very end, in a thin voice, and I held on to that, I did, but he never said the other thing. He died, and the drawer where I believed he kept his approval stayed shut, and I believed it had simply always been empty where I was concerned. We buried him. I grieved him. And the particular shape of my grief was this. I was not only mourning my father, I was mourning the last possible chance to ever be admired by him. While he was alive, there had always been, however faint, a someday. His death closed the someday. I made my peace, over those 6 months, with being a woman whose father had loved her and been disappointed by her, both at once, forever. I want to tell you about the last real conversation I had with my father, because its meaning has completely changed for me now. It was about 3 weeks before he died. He was very weak, and we were sitting together in the afternoon light, and out of nowhere, he asked me whether I still had my cameras, all insured properly. That was the conversation. He spent some of his small remaining strength asking me about insurance on my equipment. At the time, sitting there, I felt that old familiar ache. Here we are, my father is dying, and the last thing on his mind about my life's work is whether it is financially protected. I drove home that day genuinely grieving that my father would go to his grave seeing my career as a liability to be insured. I understand now what that question actually was. It was the only language he had. A man who could not say, "I am proud of what you built," was using his last strength to make sure the thing I built was safe. He was saying it. He was saying it the entire time. I just had spent 45 years unable to hear the dialect. And then, I carried the package inside, and I set it on my kitchen table, and I opened it. And the someday opened back up. It was not a large box. Inside, on top, was an envelope with my name on it. Rachel, just Rachel, in that shaking block print. And underneath the envelope, the box was full, carefully packed, of paper. Photographs, clippings, printed pages. And it took me several minutes of lifting things out and turning them over before my mind would accept what my hands were telling it, which was this. Every single item in that box was about me. There were photographs I had taken, my own work, printed out. There were pages printed from my photography website, some of them years old. There was a newspaper clipping, soft with handling, from a local paper that had once run a small feature on a wedding I had shot. There was a printout of a 5-star review a bride had written about me, with one line underlined. There was a program from a community art show I had been part of in my 30s and had nearly forgotten. My father had kept all of it. My father, the man who changed the subject when my work came up at dinner, had been quietly, privately, for decades, collecting the evidence of my life's work and keeping it in a box. I lifted the items out one by one and laid them across the kitchen table, and the table was not big enough. There was a printout of a photograph I had taken of an elderly couple at their 50th anniversary dancing, one of my own favorites, a picture I was prouder of than almost anything I had made, and my father had not only printed it, he had written the year on the back in pencil. There was the folder I had brought to that Sunday dinner when I was 26, the one he had closed and asked about my savings account. He had kept the folder. He had kept the exact folder for 19 years. I sat there holding it, and I could not breathe, because I had driven home from that dinner certain he had dismissed it, and the truth was that he had taken it home and kept it for 2 decades. The man I thought had glanced at my work and looked away had, in fact, never stopped looking. He had just done all of his looking somewhere I could not see. And then I opened the envelope, and I read my father's last letter to me, and I have read it more times now than I have read anything else I own. I am not going to read you all of it. Some of it belongs only to me. But I will tell you what my father told me, in his own words, in his own shaking hand, from the other side of his own death. He wrote that he knew. That was the first thing, and it nearly stopped me. He wrote that he knew I had grown up believing he was disappointed in me, and that he had figured it out far too late, and that he could not stand the thought of dying and leaving that belief alive in me, intact, for the rest of my life. So he had written the letter and packed the box and arranged for it to be sent, because he had not been able, and this is the part that breaks me, he had not been able to make himself say it to my face. Here is what my father had actually felt for 45 years and had never found a way to say. He wrote that of his 2 daughters, I was the one whose life he did not understand, and that this was the entire problem, and that the problem had been his and not mine. My father came from a hard, narrow place. He had grown up where work meant a wage, where a job was a thing that kept you safe, and where art, making pictures, chasing light, was not a thing a serious person was permitted to want. When Lauren went into finance, my father understood her completely. He could see the safety of it, and his pride came easily because his fear was quiet. But when I picked up a camera and walked toward a life with no salary, no firm, no floor under it, my father did not feel disappointment. He wrote the word plainly. He felt fear. He was afraid for me, every day, for decades, afraid the work would not hold me, afraid I would fall and there would be nothing to catch me. And he did not know how to speak fear. The men of his time and his town did not have language for it. So the fear came out of him as silence, as a changed subject, as a flat quiet at the dinner table, and I, sitting across from him, had read that silence, every single time, as contempt. It was never contempt. It was a frightened man watching his daughter do a brave thing he did not have the courage to understand, and not knowing how to say, I am afraid for you, so saying nothing at all. For 45 years, I had been reading the wrong word off my father's face. He wrote something else about the fear, and I have thought about it more than almost any other line. He wrote that his own father, my grandfather, a man I barely remember, had been exactly the same way, a man who felt everything and said nothing, and that my father had grown up just as starved for a word of pride as I had. He wrote that he had promised himself, as a young man, that he would not do to his children what had been done to him. And then he had done it anyway, because the silence was not a choice he kept making. It was a language he had been raised inside and never taught his way out of. He wrote, I did not want to hand this down to you, Rachel, and I handed it to you anyway, and that is the worst thing I know about myself. Reading that, I stopped being able to hold my father as the villain of my own life. He was not a man who withheld love from me. He was a man who had been handed a broken tool for showing love, and had used the broken tool his whole life, and had known it was broken, and had grieved it. That is a different man than the one I had been angry at for 45 years. That is a man I can love without an asterisk. But the letter did more than explain the silence. The letter told me what my father had actually been doing all those years in the quiet, and that was the part that sent me down onto the kitchen floor. Because the box was the proof. My father had not been ignoring my work. My father had been following it, obsessively, privately, the way you follow something you are proud of and afraid for at the same time. He had saved the clippings. He had printed the reviews. He wrote in the letter that he had kept a folder, and that the folder had become a box, and that over the years going through it had become one of the quiet pleasures of his life. He wrote that he had watched my career steady itself and hold year after year, and that each year it held was a year his fear got a little smaller and his pride got a little larger, and that he had never told me because he had spent so long being quiet that he no longer knew how to start being loud, and because every year he did not say it, saying it became harder. And there was one more thing in the letter, and it is the thing I think about most. He wrote that he had come, late in his life, to understand something about my work that he had missed entirely when I was young. He wrote that he had finally looked, really looked, at my photographs, the ones in the box, and he wrote that he had realized that his daughter had spent her whole career doing something he himself never once managed in 80 years of living. Walking up to people, to strangers, to families, and catching them in the exact half second of being unguarded, of being joyful, of being loved. He wrote that he had spent his life unable to show what he felt, and that he had raised a daughter whose entire profession was helping other people's love become visible. And he wrote that he did not think that was a disappointment. He wrote that he thought it might be the bravest thing anyone in our family had ever done. There was a list in the letter. My father had made a list, in his careful hand, numbered, of specific photographs of mine, by description, that he said he wanted me to know he considered the finest work anyone in our family had ever produced. He described them. The anniversary couple dancing, a picture of a flower girl asleep under a banquet table, a bride and her elderly mother, foreheads together, both crying. He had not just kept my work, he had studied it. He had favorites. He had thought hard enough about my photographs to rank them, to know them, to be able to call them up from memory and describe them to me on paper. My whole adult life, I had believed my father had never really looked at a single thing I made. And here, in my hands, was a numbered list proving that he had looked at all of it, for years, closely enough to love specific frames. I had to put the letter down at that point. I could not see it anymore. I sat on that kitchen floor until the windows went gray with morning, and I did the thing the letter forced me to do, which was to take 45 years and run them backward with the truth finally switched on. And a different father walked back through those years. I made myself re-examine the evidence I had spent a lifetime reading as coldness, the flat quiet when my work came up at dinner. I had heard it as boredom, as disappointment. It had been a man swallowing his fear so it would not spill onto me. The way he never asked about my business, I had heard it as not caring. The letter told me he had not asked because he was afraid of the answer, afraid one day the answer would be that it had finally fallen through. I remembered suddenly things I had filed away as meaningless. I remembered that my father had, more than once, asked me for a print of a photograph I had taken, and I had always thought he was just being polite, and I had handed them over without a thought, and I now knew exactly where those prints had been all along. They had been in the box. He had been asking me, in the only language he had, for pieces of my work to keep. And I had not been able to hear the request because I was too busy waiting for a different sentence, the one he could not say, and missing entirely the dozen quieter ones he could. The more I ran the years backward, the more of them rearranged. I remembered that my father had driven, 2 hours each way, to a small gallery show I had been part of in my 30s, and that when he got there, he had walked through it almost without comment, and I had been crushed, had read his quiet as a verdict. My mother told me later, after the box, that my father had talked about that gallery show for weeks. Weeks. He had been moved nearly to tears standing in front of my work and had not been able to produce a single sentence to tell me so, and had then talked about it to everyone except me for a month. I remembered birthday cards signed only Dad, which I had always read as the bare minimum a person could do, and I now knew, because the letter told me, that my father had found signing cards almost unbearable, because a blank card was a space demanding the words he could not find, and Dad was all the frightened man could get onto the page. Every piece of evidence I had spent a lifetime entering for the prosecution turned out, on a second reading, to belong to the defense. I had simply never called the defense. I want to be honest about the anger, because for a while there was anger, and pretending there was not would cheapen this. Because here is the cruel arithmetic. My father had everything in that box for decades. He had the pride, he had the words, he proved he had the words because he finally wrote them down. He could have handed me that letter across a table any year of my adult life. He could have said one sentence to me at any of 1,000 dinners and changed the entire way I walked through the world. And he did not. He let me spend my best years, my 30s, my early 40s, carrying a weight he had the power to lift, and he only lifted it from inside a sealed box, mailed from beyond his own grave. For a few weeks, I was angry about that. I was angry that my father had been brave enough to feel it all, and too much of a coward to say it while his voice could still reach me. But the anger did not last, and I will tell you what dissolved it. It was the letter itself, because a coward does not write that letter. A truly withholding man, a man who did not love me, would have simply died with the box in a closet and let me never know. My father, at the very end of his life, dying, did the single bravest thing his frightened and inarticulate heart had ever done. He found a way, the only way he could, a way that cost him being able to see my face when I learned it, to make sure I would not spend the rest of my life believing a lie about how he saw me. He could not give me the truth in person, so he gave it to me the only way he was able. It came late. It came in cardboard, but it came, and he made sure it came. And I have decided that the courage it took him to send it matters more than the fear that kept him from saying it sooner. And there is one more thing I made myself sit with, in the weeks of being angry, and it changed where the anger went. I had to ask myself an honest question. In 45 years, had I ever once asked him? Had I ever sat my father down and said plainly, "Dad, I need to know what you actually think of my work, because your silence is hurting me"? And the answer was no. I never had. I had spent 4 decades waiting for him to volunteer the words, reading his quiet, building my case, nursing the wound, and I had never once walked up to the wall and knocked on it. I am not saying the silence was my fault. It was not, and a child should not have to interrogate a parent for basic approval. But I was not a child for most of those years. I was a grown woman who could have asked a direct question, and I chose, year after year, to wait and to ache instead. The wall between my father's heart and his voice was his to bring down, but I never tested whether a single, honest question from my side might have opened a door in it. We were both, in the end, waiting for the other one to speak first. He waited until a letter. I waited until it was too late to ask. Neither of us was the villain. We were just 2 quiet people, related by blood, each certain the first move belonged to the other. There were things I had to do after that night, and I have done them, and I am still doing them. The first thing was my mother. I went to her, and I brought the box, and we went through it together, and I learned that she had known. She had known about the folder, the clippings, the quiet pride. She had watched my father tend that box for years. I asked her, and I tried not to let it come out as an accusation, why she had never told me. And my mother cried, and she said that it had not been hers to tell, that my father had always said he would tell me himself when he found the right way, and that she had spent years believing he eventually would. We had both, my mother and I, spent years waiting for my father to say a thing, each of us assuming the other knew he never had. There was grief in that conversation, but there was also, finally, the truth standing in the open between my mother and me, and we are closer now than the silence ever let us be. My mother told me one thing in that conversation that I will carry forever. She said that in his last months, my father had talked about the box often, had worried over it, had fussed about getting the letter right, had rewritten it more than once. And she said that the thing he was most afraid of was not dying. The thing he was most afraid of was that the package would somehow not reach me, that it would be lost, and that I would go through the rest of my life never knowing. And then, of course, the package very nearly was lost. It sat in the machinery of the postal system for 6 months, exactly the outcome he had feared. I think about that often. My father spent some of the last energy of his life terrified that his one attempt to finally tell me the truth would fail to arrive. It came within a hair of failing. It came late and battered and half a year after his death. But it came. And I am not able to think about how close it came to not coming without needing to sit down. The second thing was my sister Lauren, and this surprised me, because I had spent a lifetime quietly resenting Lauren. Not her fault, but there it was, the golden child, the easy one. And going through that box made me realize something I had never let myself see, that I had no idea what it had cost Lauren to be the one our father understood. So I asked her, and Lauren told me for the first time that being the daughter our father was openly proud of had come with its own quiet price, a lifetime of feeling that his pride was attached to her achievements and might not survive a failure, a pressure I had never had to carry because I had been written off too early to be pressured. We had each spent 40 years envying the other one's exact position. We are talking now, really talking, for the first time in our adult lives. The box did that too. Lauren said something to me in one of those first real conversations that I have not been able to put down. She said that she had always known our father was proud of my photography, that he had said so to her, privately, many times over the years. She had assumed, she told me, that of course he had also said it to me. It had genuinely never occurred to her that the words our father spoke about me behind my back were words he had never once spoken to my face. When she said that, I felt something complicated. A fresh grief that the praise had been circulating in my own family for decades and had simply never been routed to me. But also something like relief, because it meant the pride had been real and ordinary and constant, not some deathbed revelation. My father had been telling people he was proud of me for years. He had told everyone. He had told everyone but the one person who needed to hear it, because that one person was the one he could not look at while saying it. The withholding was never about the feeling. It was only ever about the wall between his feeling and his voice. A year has passed now since the package arrived. I framed one of my father's letters. Not the whole thing, just one paragraph of it. The one about my work being the bravest thing in our family. And it hangs in my studio now, where I see it every working day. The box itself I have kept, intact, exactly as he packed it. I have not added to it, and I have not taken anything out. It is the single most precious thing I own, because it is not really a box of clippings. It is the only place in the world where I can see, all at once, in physical form, 45 years of a love my father felt and could not say. He kept it for me. He just could not hand it to me until he was gone. I do something now that I did not do before. When I photograph a wedding, when I am standing at the edge of a room, watching a father look at a daughter, I watch the quiet ones. I watch the fathers who do not dance, who do not make the speech, who stand near the wall with their hands in their pockets. I used to frame my pictures around the loud joy, the obvious joy. Now I find I cannot stop photographing the quiet men at the edges, the ones whose love is happening entirely behind their faces, because I know now what I am looking at. I am looking at my father. I am looking at a feeling so large the person holding it cannot get it through the doorway of his own mouth. And I make sure now to catch it, to put it on film, so that some daughter someday, looking at my photograph, might recognize on her own father's silent face the thing it took me 45 years and a cardboard box to learn how to see. I will not pretend the timing does not still ache. I would give a great deal to have had even one conversation with my living father in which I knew what I know now, to have seen his actual face, just once, telling me what the letter told me. That conversation is not available. It never will be. That is the permanent loss inside this story, and I have stopped trying to talk myself out of grieving it. But I am no longer the disappointment. That woman, the one who walked through 45 years certain her father did not admire her, she was living in a story that was not true, and I get to stop being her. I get to be, instead, what I actually always was, a daughter her father was quietly, fearfully, enormously proud of, who simply did not get told in time. Late is not the same as never. The package proved that. And late, I have learned, when it is all you are given, can still be enough to change the rest of your life. I want to leave you with the two things this taught me. The first is about quiet people, and I am asking you to be careful with them because I got this catastrophically wrong for 45 years. Not everyone who loves you can say it. Some of the people who love you most are people who grew up where feelings were not spoken, where fear had no words, where pride was something you felt privately and never announced. And when love lives inside a person like that, it does not come out as warmth in sentences. It comes out sideways, as a saved clipping, as a request for a print, as a quiet you have to learn to read. If there is someone in your life whose silence you have spent years interpreting as coldness or disappointment, I am asking you to consider that you may be reading the wrong word. Look at what they have kept. Look at what they have followed. Look at what they do, not what they fail to say. The love may be enormous. It may simply have no door it knows how to come out of. The second thing is harder, and it is for the quiet people themselves, and it is this. Do not wait. If you are a person who feels things deeply and says them rarely, if there is pride or love or admiration sitting in a drawer inside you for someone, I am begging you, on behalf of every child who ever misread a silence, do not save it for a letter. Do not assume there will be a right moment, a better way, a someday. My father had the words. He proved he had them. And he still let his daughter carry an unnecessary wound for 45 years because saying it out loud felt too hard, and every year of not saying it made the next year harder. The someday ran out. It always runs out. Whatever true and good thing you feel about someone, find a way, clumsy, halting, imperfect today, to let them hear it while they still have a face you can watch receive it. The letter is better than nothing, but the letter is not better than your voice. If this story landed for you, drop the word package in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories. Real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. First, judge love by its evidence, not its volume. The loudest, most fluent affection is the easiest to see, and it is not always the deepest. Some of the truest love you will ever be given will be nearly silent. A person who keeps things, follows things, shows up, and never once manages the sentence you are waiting for. Before you decide a quiet person does not love or admire you, go looking for what they have quietly kept. The drawer may be full. You may simply have been listening for words when you should have been looking for proof. Second, courage delayed is still courage, but it costs the people who waited for it. If you love someone and have not told them, understand that your silence is not neutral. It is a weight you are asking them to carry, often without knowing they are carrying it. You may believe you will find the right words later. Later is not guaranteed to anyone. Say the true thing now, badly if you must, today if you can, while the person can still see your face as you say it. Do not make them learn it from a box. Don't measure love by what they said. I'll see you next time.